Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is a comprehensivist Wednesday that we do in collaboration with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. And today I am delighted to have Mike here. He's beginning a series on improv. It's going to be a 4-part series done over 4 months. So hopefully it's delightful to see so many people who have no idea what improv is. And this is going to be perfect. Okay, so we're going to use this principle of yes and Mike is going to make a presentation first, and then there is going to be some exercises which we are not going to record. Then we're going to go to breakout rooms which we are not going to record, and then we come back to talk about our takeaways. Okay, and just in the spirit of the yes and principle, though I have not seen what Mike is planning to talk about, I'm going to do yes and in the middle of his presentation whenever I feel like it. All right. So that it's just to give you an idea of what yes and looks like in a presentation, which is not usually where it is done, but I will do it anyway because I get along so well with Mike, and that's actually how we started. We were I was planning to do a presentation on Josh Waitzkin's book on art of learning. I'd already scheduled it, and Mike showed up, and I said, Mike, do you want to do this together? He said, sure. I had my own presentation. He had his own presentation, and we just went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So that's going to be similar to that, except this time, I don't know what Mike is going to say. So let's get started. Give me just a second. Hold on. Just a second here, folks. Just a second. All right. So we'll start with Mike's presentation. Mike, go ahead.
Thank you, Shrikant. Welcome, everybody. I am so happy to see all these no's in the chat. When people were asked if they had improv experience and they all wrote no, but I have news for you. You're all liars, because I'm going to begin every one of these presentations with the following statement: that life is not scripted, and whether you like it or not, you are an improviser. So I will start with that. It will be a 4-part series. Tonight, we're going to be examining in great detail this concept known as yes and, which is really the nut and bolt of any form of improvisation, whether it be comedic or theater or music or dance. Agreeing and then heightening and adding to what someone has already said is the heart and soul of improvisation. Next week, so we had a little schedule change, so I'll be presenting next week as well. And in that one, we're going to be doing something called playing the game, which is a step up, and you get a little insight into watching improvisers do something at a deeper level. And what that is as they're improvising, the 2 improvisers or 3 have already found what's known as a game. One of them may be playing a character that's absolutely crazy. They have an idea that they want to do, and we're actually going to do this later as a group. And then they have somebody else who's a friend who thinks that they're completely out of their mind. So what's happening between those 2 improvisers is they've created a game. You can't see it, but one of them is playing the crazy and the other one is actually going along. So there is a game, and that happens a lot. If you improvise musically, you may hear a bass player slightly change the bass line, and the drummer picks that up. And then that's the rhythm section in the band. So what happens is that little change in the music as they're improvising now becomes the game that the rest of the musicians can work around. So we'll get into that next week. The 3rd presentation will be something called changing places, spaces, and mood. And this one, I think, connects well to our ability to get a feel for other people. So if I'm doing a scene with Shrikant, or if I'm having a conversation with Shrikant, my ability to kind of get inside his shoes, to get an idea of what he feels, is valuable because it can affect our conversation. It's also useful to be able to shift your thinking when your emotions change. Because as I said at the beginning of the presentation, life is not scripted. So when something comes at you unexpected, having the ability to kind of stop, focus, your mood is going to change and still kind of flourish in that area. The fourth one will be a wrap up. By then, we'll have a nice feel for each other in terms of what we know about improv, what we've learned. We'll play some more formal improv games, and off we go. Okay, yes, and I wrote in the introduction the following word list that I will start with. And that word list includes the following: listen, agree, heighten, support, affirm. The word positive is stuck in the middle. And then I concluded with accept with a smile, respond with a smile. So I want to go over that word list to start, because that list is kind of the alphabet soup that if you put those together, it's going to come out and say yes, and. I'll start at the bottom. Accept with a smile, respond with a smile. If you can see my face, this is a real smile. I cannot fake a fake smile. So all of you, again, a warm welcome. Come in here with a smile. Thank you, JP. That's a beautiful smile yourself. And leave here with a smile. That's the whole purpose of this. And then I'll go back to the top with the word gift. Improvisers will sometimes substitute the word offer. When they start a scene, somebody has to say something, or they have to produce an action that creates some drama with the audience. So whatever is given, if I'm in this scene with Shrikant and I say something, I have given an offer or a gift. It is now up to Shrikant. There's the word listen that comes next. How well did he listen to my offer? He takes my offer in, whatever it is that I had just said, now becomes the new reality. And he has a responsibility. And I'm going to use 3 words at once. I could have used many, but I'm going to use 3 in a row. Agree, support, affirm. So when I say to Shrikant something, whatever it is, his first reaction, if he is in the mode of, if you can see my shirt, yes, and he wants to affirm it, he wants to agree, and he wants to support. Because once he does that, the audience knows we now have a scene. There is a very famous clip on YouTube of Tina Fey, famous improviser with CEO of Google. And she was giving a demonstration about improv, and she wants to do a scene with him. And he pulls out a fake gun and he goes, "Stop, I have a gun." And she goes, "The gun you gave us on our anniversary?" And he says to her, "We're not married." Now, what's wrong with that little, Shrikant, what's wrong with that little?
Absolutely. What she did was that she accepted the gun and she said, and we are married. So she's adding more meaning to it. And what he is doing is that he's saying, no, 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 no to what you just said. And he's saying something, but something else. Go ahead.
Got it? Now, if you go and see, I'm making up a scenario, a 2.5-year-old. So instead of Tina Fey, who's a world-class improviser, right? Instead of the CEO of Google, you go to somebody's house and there's a 2.5-year-old on the carpet. And the mom is there talking about the 2, and the kid likes to chat you up. And the mom said, you know, I'll make up a name, Maritza, she made a house today for Superman. And the kid looks up at me and goes, yeah, I made Superman a house. And I go, listen to my voice. Really? You made a house for Superman? So I'm affirming. I just told this 2.5-year-old, I can guarantee you the next words out of that 2.5-year-old's mouth, yeah, and it's in the kitchen. Wow, you made a house for Superman and it's in that kitchen? Yeah. You want to see? I sure do. So I get up, I take that kid by the hand. I'm not walking the kid is walking me, and I'm walking into that kitchen. And I don't know, I'm making this up. Maybe mom is a structural engineer. So as an adult, I walk into that room, and what do I expect to see? This elaborate Lego configuration that the mom and the kid worked out forever. But that's not what I see. I see a shoebox on the floor. It's a shoebox. And I go, wow, that's Superman's house. And the kid goes, yeah, and he's in there right now. Now, what just happened there? You probably all have kids that age in your life. Listen to them. They are the best improvisers. Little kids, if you catch them in that imagination, they are going to yes and you to death. They're never going to stop. And the more that you allow it. Now, if the CEO in Google is as bad an improviser or as bad a dad as an improviser, which I'm sure he's not, if you walked into that living room and that kid is sitting down and you say, or the mom said, Maritza built Superman a house. And I go, what? You built a house? Yeah, and it's in our kitchen. You can't fit a house in a kitchen. Do you know what you would do to that kid? All that work they put in to put the shoebox right in the middle. So hopefully improvisation is everywhere. Yes, and a little comedic outside of what I had planned today. I improved with a scammer on the phone today at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. True story. I get them all the time. It's one of my favorite ways to improvise. I get a call on the phone for, I don't know, we're here to help your US healthcare. Do you have Medicare plan A and B? And I said, good evening. Oh, yes, I do. Thank you. That's very kind. And whatever this scammer said to me, I responded with yes and, but I became Hannibal Lecter from The Silence of the Lambs. Now, if you know the movie, Hannibal Lecter is completely insane. Do you have Medicare Part A and B? Why, yes, I do. As a matter of fact, I think it's about to expire. Where are you calling from, by the way? They always tell me a place like Florida, but I can tell they're not calling from Florida. If they say Florida, I say, yes, that's so nice there. I've had many fine meals there. And I just improv my way through the whole scam. I did that today. So you can improvise yes and anywhere. Let me finish another word here. I put another word out. Heighten. Heighten. I give Shrikant anything in a scene. It's now his job to take what I gave him and not only affirm it. Yes, it is, Mike, you now have a raccoon on your head. But he's going to look at that raccoon on my head and somehow heighten that, doing his best not to ask me too many questions. At the beginning, improvisers, because it can be a little nerve-wracking, you're trying to learn the art of improvisation. So it's really normal. Even
how did you teach the raccoon to be an acrobat so he can manage to balance on your head? That's an incredible achievement.
There it is. I spent weeks studying the art of raccoon levitation. And all of a sudden, now we have a levitating raccoon, and it won't be denied. And it's fun. And here's another little trick. Like Myron, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. You have a beautiful smile. So when Shrikant said that it made you smile, it's absolutely amazing that in these activities that we'll do together, when you put a smile on your face, absolutely amazing what happens to your conversation. All of those words that I listed, by the way, get wrapped tonight in a positive view.
Yes.
In improvisation.
Yes. And have you wondered why it works? I think the secret is in the first word, the smile. When you actually take in the smile of another person and you smile in response, what you're saying is you are saying yes to the person itself. Forget about what they're saying. That is secondary. You're saying yes to this another human being. And then you are adding a piece of your own as a human being, as an authentic human being. And then they take that and do yes and to that. That is the fundamental reason why yes and is the foundation of good improvisation and good life. Go ahead.
Perfect. So the next step, if you are, or I don't know how you felt about me saying that you are already improvisers, which I believe wholeheartedly you are, then the question would be, well, where do you get to practice? So I say everywhere. Today I improvised with a scammer. I made up little Maritza, the 2.5-year-old. I just made that up. But it's kind of not hard for me to keep doing that. So I am an amateur improviser. I just joined a group and I'm starting to perform again. And one thing that was suggested for me to work on the craft at the amateur level is to constantly improvise, constantly. And how do you do that? So that could be one topic we can kick around in the breakout room. So I'll share a couple of things that I do, and then I'm sure Shrikant will have some back and forth on these ideas. So back to that whole idea of an offer. So in conversation, so in an offering conversation, the people who are really good at it are the ones who can start a conversation. But if you want to do it from the view of an improviser, then you have to look for the cues. So I always talk about being at a Trader Joe's. That is my that's my number one example of interpersonal, working on interpersonal skill, at a Trader Joe's. So you're at a Trader Joe's and you're second online. There's somebody checking out before you. What would some of the cues, so Shrikant, I'll ask you this question. We can do a little back and forth here. So you live in New York City.
Yes.
And you're kind of known and famous for starting conversations that can last 2 to 3 hours out of nowhere.
Yep.
You just pop up.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's got to be some yes and built into your DNA, right? So I'll just ask you, if you walked into a grocery store and you're second in line and you were observing the people in front of you and you wanted to have a very, very quick interaction, what would some of the cues be that you might look for to start a conversation?
Look from the other person?
Anywhere that's in your immediate view.
Right. So what I have, there are a couple of things. I mean, one is that I have a very deep strategy because I have like things in my back pocket that I can use anytime.
Yeah.
Okay. Number two, I try to observe what the person is doing and say something that is interesting related to that. Now, luckily, I have enough interest and enough kind of base that I can always find something. My favorite line to start things off, not in the Trader Joe's because I consider city to be my domain, is to say, where are you visiting from? Now, it may seem like a very simple line, but I will say this regardless of whether I think they are a tourist or not. So the tourist would immediately come back and say, how did you know that I was a tourist? Okay. Or they will give me a straight answer. Okay. Now, if it is a New Yorker, he will act offended. He says, no, I live here. And then that gives me an opportunity of saying, no, but where are you really from? Where did you come from? And then if they say they're actually born and brought up in New York, then I would say, oh, that's really unusual. I've never really seen anybody like that. Something like that. So it's like the start itself allows me to give interesting, or a tree of interesting reactions. And during this time, I'm finding out who this person is, and then I will use that information to figure out what direction to take the conversation.
Right. I like what you said that you, when you started your answer, you said it's in your back pocket,
Yep.
which is the sign of somebody who works on this, and that which is a great idea that you can learn these ideas. You can take, so again, a little experiment. The next time that you're out somewhere, you might be willing to try what Shrikant just said. some of you do live in cities and somewhere, you might want to just throw that line or create your own. And I think it's the process of learning how to create your own in your own environment. So if it happened to be a Trader Joe's and there's somebody in front, one of my favorites that I keep in the pocket all the time is I tell people, now I tell mostly women, maybe, I don't know, I'm biased. I think that women seem to be attracted to the chocolate bars at the checkout. This is my own opinion, more than the men that I see there. And one of my favorite things to say is, do those candy bars talk to you as well? Or sometimes I'll stand, if it's just me and the cashier, I may actually just look at the candy bars. And I've mentioned this before, and I'll say, I'm not talking to you right now. And I'm not looking at anyone. I'm looking at a rack of candy bars. Now that's uncomfortable if you're not used to doing that, but you don't have to start there. But all I'm trying to say is you can improvise anywhere, especially with the yes and. And if you get in the habit of, let's say you're on that line and somebody is wearing, I live in New York, so somebody's wearing a Yankee hat. I am a New York Met fan. So if you're a baseball fan and you happen to know anything about New York, oh, look at Laura putting that thumb down with the Mets. So imagine if Laura was wearing the Yankee hat and I lean into her and I say something like, oh, yeah, you're a Yankee fan. You've had all these world championships. Yeah, well, I'm a Met fan. Maybe we'll be better than you this year. You know what I'm doing? I'm actually acting like the adult that told that 2.5-year-old, how can you build a house out of a shoebox? I'm completely denying and killing that moment. What I do all the time, if I see a Yankee fan, especially if I know one that's real, a real fan, one that I've known, I will say from the back of the line, do you let Met fans on this line? To me, that... I'm telling you, more often than not, somebody on that line is going to turn around and say something funny. And if I get to the person that I know, then what happens is we're already at it. Now, he's checking out my groceries. I'm paying for my groceries. That has nothing to do with, I need to get groceries, but that's not the fun. I'm having the most fun with that quick interaction. Now, let's say I happen to know Laura, but let's say I didn't know Laura and Laura's wearing a Yankee hat and I'm a big Met fan. I could go up to her and say, you have no idea how lucky you are. You're a Yankee fan? I said, I've been a long-suffering Met fan since 1969. Oh, I can't take it anymore. So what am I doing to her? I'm giving her a gift. I'm not saying anything disparaging about the Yankees. Yes, and I know a little something about the Yankees, so I'm going to talk about her team. Now, you can plug this in. I'm using baseball as an example. I live in New York. I'm familiar with New York baseball. Those are variables. The whole thing that we want to get started tonight is the whole idea of yes and. Yes and. Create your own. So as a matter of fact, you can put it in the back of your mind as a mini experiment. So if you come back next week or the following month for the other meetups, maybe a little feedback. And in the meetup room, breakout rooms later today, maybe you're already doing this. Some of you have your own things in your pocket that I think would be very, very helpful. Shrikant, so you have that in your pocket. And you have also had, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you said that you have met people out of the blue and you've had conversations that have gone for 2 to 3 hours. Is this correct?
Yes, absolutely. Because what I'm really fascinated with people, good people. I actually, so if I see somebody whom I think might be interesting, I'll start talking to them.
Yeah.
And then it's a question of quickly finding common values. What yes and does is that it creates this resonant loop of common values. And you keep building on it, So it's a question of discovering common values and then building on it.
Right. But it takes practice. Would you agree?
Yes. The more you do that, the better you're going to get at it.
Right. Right.
And the only thing that really stops you is fear.
Yeah.
That's the only thing. Fear is the mind killer,
Correct.
and it is also the fun killer. So that's the only thing that
Correct.
stops you.
Yeah, it's so true, because you have when you're uncomfortable, you tend to ask a lot of questions as a new improviser. You go back with a question, and if you go back with a question, as the CEO did to Tina Fey, or he'll make a statement or deny it. That's not a gun. But if Shrikant says to me, my goodness gracious, you've got a full-grown raccoon in your head. If I go back to Shrikant and say, do you like raccoons? Now, what I've done is I've just kind of taken what he's given me, again, that offer, and I gave it back to him in an empty box, because I've added nothing to the conversation. Now the onus is on Shrikant to, again, add information to the scene. He started out by saying, my goodness, Mike, you have a full-grown raccoon in your head. And I could just say, man, I'm really cute, aren't I? If I just come right back at him and said, oh my God, this has changed my life. I feel amazing. So what's happened between us now? You're looking at one character who's completely embracing and in love with the fact that there's a full-grown raccoon on my head. We could take that information in a million different directions, as long as we keep yes and. Shrikant may come back. It goes on and on and on. But the minute I go back to him and I say, Shrikant, do you like raccoons? Now he has to think and now create for the audience, does his character like raccoons or not? So we're going to be doing some exercises later. And again, we're not recording. And by no means, if you ask a question, if you watch the pros, they ask tons of questions. But in general, we want to concentrate on end, what comes next. Shrikant.
Yes. The real beauty of this yes and principle is the value of listening. What happens is that you already have something in your mind. What the other person is doing is giving you something radically different just by being another person. If you listen closely to that, it's going to add richness to what you have, what you have said. Now, I could respond to Mike. He said, you know what? I considered the raccoon on the head, but I prefer bunnies instead. So I went to the store of this living animal hats, and I went through all of them, but I like the smell of bunnies better than the smell of raccoons. So something like that. So it's like you keep expanding the thing. So now you have like a whole store with multiple animals and multiple hats, and you put that on the table. The other principle that Mike is talking about is that when you do an empty thing, you are actually putting the entire onus on the other person to come up with new things. What you have to do is that you have to come up, you have to do yes and means you take in what they have said and you add something interesting of your own to what has been said, and then just offer it to them here on a platter. Here it is. Now they can take it in any direction and they don't have to do much work. So you have to make it as easy for them as possible.
Correct. And if you, I could have, preparing for the meetup, there's so much information about yes and. It may be, I don't know, I would venture to say it may be the number one reason that you may see an organization or a corporation hire improvisers to do a workshop. I don't know if any of you have had anybody come into where you work, but that's one of the main reasons, because it fosters the collaboration. And also, it also sets the seed for that type of mindset, which takes practice. So I worked one out for myself that I want to share with the group before we do some exercises. Shrikant, I'd be very curious to know what you think. So if if you're a seeker or in the self-improvement realm, and you're constantly looking for ways to improve yourself, et cetera, a lot of us here might admit sometimes that we get caught in a negative loop. So again, you're having the same yes and conversation with yourself, but you're kind of doing yes, but, or no, maybe with yourself. That happens sometimes. And what I found is my own personal negative loop sometimes, I examine it closely. And I try to create this transcript in my head of something that let's say that I'm afraid to do or I'm uncomfortable doing. And somebody, it's famous one, said, if you could do anything in the world that you wanted and you knew that you could not fail, guaranteed success, romantic, financial, well, what would you do? You know, if I gave that to you, here it is, it's a gift. You cannot fail. Take it. What would you do? So what happened with me is I'm working. Go ahead, Shrikant.
No, that's fine. I want to hear what you got to say. Go ahead.
Yeah. So to me, I kind of did a transcript. I didn't write it out, but I had this transcript running in my mind sometimes when I'm personally caught in a negative loop. So my thoughts are taking me away from a goal or away from doing something back. And I really look at it and I go, you know what? That's irrational. That is not rational thought. Yes, it's possible that this could happen, or yes, it's possible my result might not be what I want, but for all of these things to happen and for this loop to keep spinning like this, I think it's irrational. So then what I said is, well, you know, I know a little something about positive self-talk. I've been a coach for 31 years, forever, and I'm constantly trying to create positive loops for my student visualization techniques. Much the way golfers are kind of trained to see shots before they're hit. And I went through the complete opposite. So instead of saying no, but it was yes and. So I have some interests in my life. I want to be fluent in Spanish someday, right? I want to become fluent in Spanish. I'm not. I struggle with the language. You know, if you put me in that shoebox in Spain, I'll find my way back home, but I'm not fluent in the language. There's a musical instrument I want to play again and improve on, and I can just go on and on and on. Do you know what you can do? It worked for me, is I can create just as an irrational set of yes and steps. Yes, I'm learning how to swim this summer. Listen carefully to this, because this didn't happen, but this all could happen because of one thing that I did this summer. I'm learning how to swim. I joined a pool. So I'm going to take you from joining that pool up in the following way. Yes, I joined a pool this summer, and I'm going to say yes and after each sentence. So it's going to sound a little funny, but you'll get the point. Yes, and at that pool, I met a woman named Natalie, who's from Colombia, obviously fluent in Spanish, and she noticed my baseball hat. Turns out she had a cousin who wanted to play baseball. I have the courage, because in my pocket, I have some lines that I can ask in Spanish to start a conversation. Turns out Natalie is single. I'm single. Natalie and I started to date. Her father is a world-class musician. Natalie's father and I got to know each other really well. Found out I used to play the drums when I was young. Encouraged me to practice. I gave him an excuse. I live in an apartment. He gave me an electronic set of drums. I'm starting to play the drums again. I'm getting good enough where I'm actually going to sit in with one of his bands. Yes, and my Spanish is really improved. It's actually getting to the point where I can't wait to start conversations in Spanish. Now, I have a question for you. Why can't I do any of that? Natalie doesn't exist. I did join a pool. But what I found myself doing is, that's kind of irrational, right? How those things just snapped into place for me. But isn't it just as irrational for me to sit back and go, yeah, I joined the pool. Yeah, I'm probably getting too much sun. I'm bald. I'm gonna, oh man, I should get out of the sun. Like, but I could just take that negative loop and let it wrap around my head over and over and over again. So I'm kind of borrowing this from Jordan Peterson, but if you learn the technique of yes and, the simple take anything in your mind, put it in a positive reference, and aim at something. Just aim it at something. And if you happen to create a staircase that's not real yet, so what? You're aiming up. Yes, and you're not, yeah, but. So I will conclude with the following, that preparing for the meetup, again, a little, just to tie things up, the opportunities for you to improvise are everywhere. I really believe that. And I also found that improvisation helps you to learn how to think in the box as well, not just out of the box, because so much of the funny and rich things, they're right in front of you. They're right in front. But the listening aspect of the yes and equation is real important for you to access that. So Shrikant, if you have any final thoughts before we.
Sure. I mean, I think if you just got this yes and idea, that's all, that's really the foundation. That's the only thing in improv. Everything else is just a variation on it, building on it. So this is it. If you get the idea, and it's very simple. It is, as I was saying, it is based on saying yes to the other person so that you actually listen to them. And then feel free to express yourself in relation to what you have experienced. And the result of it is this virtuous cycle that keeps on building on itself. That's all it is. That's all it is. It is that simple. And it can work, it just works beautifully. So try it out and see what happens.
Yeah, and listen, before we start the exercises, you probably don't want your airline pilot improvising the landing. If you have a doctor performing surgery, there comes a point where, so I'm not trying to be, I'm a realist about all this, but give it a try and really, we'll find out where improvisation fits in your life now a little bit. And I'm curious next meetup if you come back with a little bit of feedback from there. So Shrikant, if you don't have any final notes, I'd like to play a game with everyone that's called The Best Idea Ever. And basically, Shrikant, you have
Shall we go ahead and stop the recording?
Yes, you can stop the recording. Yep.
Go ahead, folks. So now it's time for takeaways. What did you get? What did you learn? What did you think? Go ahead and type exclamation mark. We'll start with Evanique.
What I learned is to, not take yourself so seriously, to think on your feet, and, don't be afraid to fail. I mean, fail, you get up and you do it again.
Wonderful. Next up is Laura, Joe, and JP. Laura.
Can never get, okay. I think we ought to take 52 living ideas on the road. We have an improv company now and we're going on the road.
Wonderful. Next up is Joe.
I like how it forces you to listen and to build off the other person's idea. And I think that that's actually a very powerful thing to be able to do in any kind of, when you're even making comments about, serious topics. Yes, and then be able to build off of that. That is actually, that's something we do here at 52 Living Ideas. And to your point earlier, you have to be intensely listening to every word what the person's saying, and then you can take that and you can transition it into something else, and it makes for a great conversation.
Wonderful. I fully agree. I think it's a core skill And it's the easiest way of practicing that skill with so little to lose. It is just, it's just a great way of doing that. Next up is JP, followed by Jason. JP.
I realize that all of you all have learned a lot from the Tao Te Ching, the Bhagavad Gita, Jung, and all those other philosophies. In the end, it's all humor.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Jason.
So yeah, I've been doing improv for about 8 years now, and so I've done improv with a lot of people who are very seasoned, but there's still something super special about seeing improv being done by the uninitiated, right? And seeing it's like seeing someone take your favorite food, taste it for the first time, and see how they react to it, and to know that as they seem transformed by it, it kind of reaffirms to you who's familiar with that food that this is really something special and that it just needs to be put out there even more.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Myron, followed by Allison. Myron.
I think what really helped this exercise go along was when I realized that the whole yes and is actually how a lot of us already talk in real life.
Excellent point. Yeah, absolutely. It just focuses on that aspect and this win-win. It's basically win-win idea implemented on a small scale. Next up is Allison.
I thought the funniest moments were the things that were really very ordinary things that happen to all of us all the time. And also this whole experience reminds me a lot of writing collaborative poetry, where you're building on each other.
Absolutely. Excellent point. All right, Laura. Laura, followed by Maritza. Laura, you need to unmute. Okay, let's go with Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
So,
Go ahead, Maritza.
I found it to be interesting seeing, I see several of you like a lot, at least once a week, sometimes more than once. So it's fun to see a lighthearted side, kind of. But also for me, what was most fascinating, honestly, was we're giving instructions. We're said, use yes, and, you're supposed to be positive. You're going to agree and build. And it's interesting seeing how it's in our nature to use but, or to say accept. And so it was really fascinating to watch people correct themselves and then to build on it still. And it's nice because it makes you realize that that's also just life. If we know that yes and is like an easier path forward, or perhaps a better conversational path forward for us, even when we use but or we have accept and we're maybe focusing on a negative, there's always the ability to correct and find our way back to the yes and. So that was really fun to see here today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Laura, followed by Becky. Laura.
Two things I'd like to say. One is the fact of interjecting humor in all of this, I think is really important, that we can switch gears on that very nicely. And the second part of the story that I wanted to say, which is going to blank out on me in a minute. Oh, I know. I think this is a really interesting way. If you want to talk about how we might be able to build communities, I think this could be a really good technique for getting people engaged, because it's you and me and yes, and we can begin to build a discourse in this manner. And I think it would be terrific if we should try this. Would be really cool. Go out into the field. Let's go out into the field and try this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Next up is Becky.
Do some research.
Becky, go ahead.
Research.
Thank you.
So I thought it was really interesting because when we're doing the yes and, we're listening, but we're keeping our mind open in order to have like what if, and then also all the recalls and the associations that are happening and building off of that, that's coming from the right side. And but when we say but, it happens when our brain has like that inhibitory reaction, and that's from the other side of the hemisphere that really puts a stop to it. And so it's like we have like, you know, you want to keep creative and open, yes, and then but using the word but, it's like the other one's kicking back into reality. Here are all the constraints, and here's but this rule, that rule. So it was very interesting to see that at play when we use the word but. And it's what Mike was saying earlier, like we're cutting it off when we say but. And that also is that feeling when we have that interaction. And a lot of it isn't just words, it's what you said with that smile. It causes that emotional side of our brain to like light up. So starting with the smile is very good insight.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, so I want to now focus on the concept of yes and, but let me first see what's going on with Mike. Mike, are you back?
I think I'm back.
You're back in audio and video. Amazing.
I hope you
magical.
I went on a really nice trip, if anybody cares.
Wonderful. So everybody was talking such amazing things behind your back.
Yeah, I'm sure.
We did, Mike. It was all very good.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, believe it.
Wonderful. So I want to now focus on the principle of yes and, because it's a very deep principle. You know, Mike made several points about it, but I want to hear, because, you know, initial question was about the improv experience itself. Many of you talked about the yes and. So let's focus on the yes and. You know, what is it that makes it really work? I think it's fundamentally listening, because listening to something that is new to you, the other person is actually new to you, you know, and this is not just what they are saying, but who they are, how they are saying it. There is just so much information that is coming your way. And most of the time, most of us are wrapped into our own thoughts, our own feelings, our own habits. And we have a tendency of just keeping on producing the same thing. Listening to the other person is like listening to reality, and genuinely listening to it. And then you have to speak. So this, you know, my favorite quote by Louis Sullivan, you have to let life break in upon you. And a continuous breaking in of the life and breaking out from the inside is what shapes your destiny. So this basic movement of genuinely taking in life and genuinely speaking out from the core of your being is very deep, and it is a principle that is applicable across the board. Here in improv context, you get to practice it at a very small scale, in a very friendly, fun context. Take the same idea and scale it up massively across time, across endeavors. I think it can be magical. So that's my take on the yes and principle. So now I look forward to hearing from you folks. It's going to be Joe, Maritza, Allison. What do you think yes and is, and why does it work? Why do you think it works? Joe.
One, you're almost restating what the person has said. So that's kind of, you're making a point of clarification, which is kind of key when you're having a conversation, and you're clarifying the point, but you're adding to it. See, because most people, I've heard, you know, a friend of mine says a term, he said most people have intersecting monologues. and they don't necessarily have dialogues. And what happens is not only this, you're exploring somebody else's idea. You're not saying no to it. You're not shutting it down. You're even getting the context by which where they're coming from in that process. Because once you start restating the idea, you start to say, well, where did this come from? And how am I, if I'm building on this idea, tell me a story that makes sense. And then I start to understand their story, their perspective. And that's a very powerful thing, because you have not only context about the actual problem, you have more information about the person, and you're completely open when you have this as a rule. You're following something that you're not going to shut it down. You're going to do your best to make it work. It may still not work, but it will still give you a better chance of understanding the other person's perspective, and really exploring and learning something new authentically and organically.
Yes, and this idea is fundamental to what we do at 52 Living Ideas. Because if you look at all the conversations we do, this is the idea that is underlying it, that we are actually trying to listen to what everybody is saying, and then we are trying to speak our mind. And that's what everybody is doing. That's what makes the interaction very rich. So this is like 52 Living Ideas conversation is like this yes and, with multiple people doing yes and at the same time. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Maritza, followed by Allison. Maritza.
So the concept of yes and, it's so appealing because it puts the two people in the conversation on the same side. If I've already accepted that I'm going to yes and in this scenario, well, then there's no either or. There's no you versus me, us versus them. That has to, by definition, it has to fall to the side. And there's something about our brains that makes us more willing and open to shift in perspectives when we're not polarizing and separating individuals into categories. If we fall in the same category, we tend to be more open to just about anything that's said or done by those within our grouping. And so the nice thing here is that if you are beginning a dialogue and you've already accepted that you're on the same side, it just makes the experience just entirely, you start on a different foot. I often say position open. And this is, before I was introduced to the concept of yes and, that's what comes to mind for me. It's one of those, you've heard me make this a reference before, Shrikant, and some of you, if you're dancing, when I used to teach people women how to dance in salsa, sometimes the spins are very fast. We don't usually know what they're gonna, and we never know what the guy's gonna choose. But I used to always tell the ladies, you don't have to know the spin. You don't have to know what's doing. Let him guide you. And no matter what happens, when he stops spinning you, kick your right foot back. Doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter if you tripped. Doesn't matter if you looked terrible. Kick your right foot back. Why? Because now you're position open. And if you kick your right foot back, you're in a position where you can continue dancing. There is room for maneuverability. And I find that this yes and does exactly that for us in a conversation. And I think that it's just, even the words, it's even if there's something different between doing it and using the words, even like just when I hear somebody say yes and, my brain's like, oh, okay, this person is willing to be reasonable. Or even if, that's not an accurate assessment, it just makes me more willing to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're listening to my point of view or my perspective, and that they might be hearing me. So I, in turn, will be more open and to listen to their perspective. And I think it reshapes our just our brain a little bit, and so that the approach is entirely different, as if you were to start and your first opening was but, because now, and Becky mentioned that it causes an exception, and then it tells the other person, I'm closed to this idea, or I'm putting you on that side of the fence and me on this side. So I think it's it's seemingly innocuous, but a very, very powerful, tiny phrase that just changes all, like, the whole conversation before you've said more than 2 words, which is pretty amazing.
Yes, and the reason it works so well is that it leverages the mirror neurons. So we have mirror neurons. So when you're actually trying to imitate, you're trying to take in the other person, you have your mirror neurons helping you. Now, what that enables is that it enables you to see another perspective, that other person's perspective. Now, that is such a cheap way, inexpensive way of getting a new perspective. You're simply being open to this other person. So you take that in, and it allows you to look at what you were looking at from that person's perspective. When you're actually listening to someone, you're actually giving them a standing place in your head for a moment and seeing what the world looks like for a moment from their perspective in a genuine way. And maybe the light that they are shining is in a different direction of reality, and you notice something new that lights up your consciousness. And then you offer that back to them. And what you're offering is incredibly rich and interesting to the other person. It is interesting to the other person, partly because it is acknowledging some fundamental thing about them, which they may not themselves have noticed. And it is rich because you're adding something to it, which is uniquely of your own. And this process continues so that you keep seeing new parts of reality. Another way of saying this is that this is like a joint exploration of the world. The world is very large, and each of us are like flashlights pointing at different directions. This is saying, oh, I see that because that other person was pointed this way. My mirror neurons enabled me to point that way. And hey, this is what I saw based on what they pointed out and where I was pointed. And that's what I hand back. And it goes on and on. Wonderful. Next up is going to be Allison, Evanique, and Jason. Allison.
I think the thing that's hard about doing this is that, and how it differs from a conversation, is that in a conversation, you're really reacting to each other. But when you're doing this, you're performing. So like I was consciously always trying to think of something funny to do. And when you're trying to think about being funny, you're not really, I mean, you're reacting to what they're saying, but you're building on it to, create entertainment in a way. But I feel like that's really different from a conversation. But I think that this is a really useful thing in conversation, because when you say yes, and you're validating what they just told you, and they know that you've heard them. And I think that's a really important thing, because when people are talking, they want to feel like not just that this other person is there and you're exchanging words, but that they've really heard what you had to say. So I think it's a really, useful tool in that way. And it's actually, I mean, I love that we have the Zoom because we're all over the place and we all get to see each other. But one of the things that I don't like about it is that because you've got to wait your turn, sometimes by the time it's your turn, you're thinking about, you want to respond to something somebody else said, and it's like 8 people later and it sort of doesn't really quite make sense anymore, which is different from, even if you have a conversation with like 8 people together in a room, you can kind of do that. But, one-on-one really is the ideal thing if you really want, to have any depth to conversation.
Yes. And when you have more people, you should feel free to do yes and to anything that is coming along. That's what like many people have noticed, that they originally plan to say something and then there is more yes and yes and yes and always feel free to forget about what you were intending to say initially, if
Right.
you think that the next thing is more interesting. And then when you get to speak, say yes and to many things if you want, or the thing that really, really interests you.
Yeah.
Yes. And the interesting thing is the commonality between a deep conversation and a funny conversation. Okay. There is something common to both of them. A good humor is something that shows you something unexpected, which immediately a moment later makes sense. So it is like, what? Oh, that is the pattern that humor has. A really great conversation when you are actually trying to interface with another human being has a characteristic like that. It's not intended for that. You're not trying to achieve that, but you actually end up achieving that. If you're trying to really know the other person and say, oh, I did not notice that. Oh, and now this is how it is connected. So I see lots of commonalities. I find that practicing improv, firstly, loosens you up a little bit, because most of us are too tightly held to our ways of doing things. So this actually loosens it up. So you feel freer to explore different ways of interaction. And I think that freedom to express yourself actually makes your serious conversations far more deeper, because you need the same lability, the same flexibility, same flowing like water at that deep level that you need, that you're trying to achieve here. So to me, all of it is just one thing.
Yeah, you know what I think is interesting, how the Jerry Seinfeld had that show, Cars and Comedians, or Comedians and Cars, or whatever it was. But there is something about a road trip. You know, it doesn't have to be like 5 days long, but just getting in the car and driving with somebody. And it brings, I guess, because everything else is gone, except, you know, you're in the car with this person. And it really brings out amazing conversations, you know? And I don't know, I did a road trip earlier in the summer with a very old friend. And I mean, half the time we're like laughing hysterically. And then other times we're like incredibly serious. And then we go back to laughing. And you know, she and I were saying, like, there is something about that car, you know, and you're seeing different things as you're driving along. But I don't know, it's just different. Because I feel like if you're out of the car, out and about, like, I don't know, I guess maybe because other people come in, you know, but you're in the car trapped. It's just the best conversations. I don't know.
Yes. And Allison, imagine that we are right now taking a car ride together.
Yeah.
And you're taking this car ride in turn. You're just rotating Shrikant out and putting Maritza in. And
Yeah.
you can have little snippets and you can have little bits of it. Yes. Having one-on-one conversation is amazing with
Yeah.
people that you like. But there is something also magical about having such conversations with so many people who are like-minded, and
Yeah.
the perspectives that they bring is richer. So yes, and to both of them. Next up is going to be, I've lost track here, Evanique.
Yeah, I think one thing about the yes and principle is you can recognize two things being true at once. So when you're doing yes and, you can see the other person's perspective and still see the truth in what you're saying. And you can build off of each other and create something new. I think that that's the beauty of yes and. It's like you're opening up like other people have said, you're opening up to what the other people are saying, you're validating what they're saying, and you're still recognizing, well, both can be true and exist in the same moment. And that creates collaboration rather than, you listening to speak. I think one of the cool things about improv is that, and especially the way Mike teaches it, is that you have to listen. You have no other choice, because you have to build off of what that person's saying, and saying yes and instead of but. I think Mike did the greatest example when he was talking about little Maritza building the house for Superman, and the person going in and telling little Maritza that that is the greatest house in the world. That's the most wonderful thing in the world. Or that person killing Maritza's dream, or killing her creativity by saying it's a shoebox. Like, this is not a house. A house cannot fit in a kitchen, especially a house for Superman. Like, there's room for not being practical all the time. And you can build on it, and you can help Maritza create an even greater house, and help her, and when you're doing yes and, you can say, well, can I join in building with you? I think it just creates that spirit. Whereas you're like, when you're tearing someone down, or you're knocking down without their idea, and even when you say something like, oh, I don't think that's going to work, right? Before you even listen to that person, or maybe in saying it's not going to work, let's talk about how we can make this work and see if it's workable. I think shooting a person down, it doesn't work. But when you go in with yes and, you're building that person up, and you're building yourself up too, because you're, like you said, you're collaborating now. So instead of like tearing someone down, you're building up. And if this principle was applied, I think, not to be all Pollyanna and stuff, but I truly think you would have more creation in this world, and more people being able to express themselves, if this yes and principle was applied. So thank you, Mike, for bringing this out. Great job tonight, by the way.
Yes, and my favorite thing about this principle, when you fully explicate it, fully get the hang of it, is that it actually respects the dignity of the other person and your own dignity. It is not about saying it's all about them. It is simply accepting, respecting who they are, and then saying something authentically. So it is authentic relationship, relating to each other, is what produces the most amazing interaction in improv. You will often have people who are doing yes and you can see they're very different people. They are going in different directions, but they are bouncing off one another, and they respect the different directions in which they're bouncing, but they're working on this together. Next up is going.
Oh, can I just say one thing real
please.
quick? You just made me think of I was listening to Jordan Peterson, and he was saying, you need people that disagree with you or have opposite views of you, right? And when you were saying that, being authentic in your communication with that person, but you can have that conversation in a way that, again, creates that collaboration, even when, you may disagree with how to get there. Even though you disagree with how to get there, you can work together and say, this is how we're going to do it. And you both can agree on that.
Wonderful. Next up, we're going to have Jason, and then we're going to do a little, to close out, we're going to do a little improv on this wonderful piece that Allison has put in the chat. Okay, I want to get additional ideas on that. Okay, so Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll try to make it brief here. When I think about, I love everyone's comments, by the way. When I think about what yes and means, though, it's sometimes it's really, really hard to yes and someone who you vehemently disagree with, right? And I think during the pandemic, we all came across people like that from various sides of the spectrum, right? Some more than others. And put into the real world, yes, and can be really hard. And that's why it's so important for us to all be practicing it in whatever way we can. With, again, holidays are right around the corner, right? So there's going to be crazy conversations that are going to pop up and people are going to get heated. And for all of us in this group right now, what set of tools are we going to be able to fall back on in order to not only diffuse those, ridiculously heated for no reason arguments, right? How are we going to diffuse them, and how not only going to just diffuse them, but also how are we going to, like, I think someone said, I think maybe Evanique said it, how are we going to like build something? How are we going to build bridges? How are we going to do that fundamental thing that has kept humanity advancing where it has advanced, and avoid the thing that happens where humanity doesn't advance, right? Because civilizations have died, not just villages or cities, but civilizations have died because they were unable to connect in ways that led to progress, right? So just boiling it down real quick, sometimes it's hard to say that the word actually yes, right? Sometimes what I do, if I really just can't fully come to agreement with something that someone said, I just try to say, you might be right, or I can see your point, or yeah, sure. Where I'm not really agreeing, I'm just saying, yeah, I'm just saying, okay. And then that puts, what that does, I think, to that other person who just said the crazy thing, right? That's crazy in quotes. It gets them to be less defensive, and it gets them to actually listen to what I'm about to say. Because most of the time when we don't hear each other, it's not because we're literally going like this. It's not because we are literally just looking at somewhere else. It's because we have our internal dialogue starts back up, right? So we all have our engines going. If you imagine an RPM, so you can have your RPM going, like revving, your engine ready to go. You're ready to come out with something like a response, or your RPMs are kind of low. You're idling your engine, in which case you're on, but you're not like trying to come up with the next thing. And when we say no, and here's why, what does that do to the other person? It gets them in the defensive mode, and they haven't heard a single thing you said after the word no. What they're hearing is their own internal dialogue getting ready to launch back at you. And so what you end up having is two people knowing each other, no. And every time when the other person is speaking, the other person is just getting something ready. So it's letting, versus the opposite, where if I say, yeah, you might have a point, now you, as the person who is listening to me, you're calm, you're not getting a response ready. And now I'm saying my point. Maybe I'm building off what you said. Maybe I'm just adding a question to what you said, just to get you to think of you're the crazy one. I'm just going to ask a question. I'm going to say yes to whatever you just said, but I'm going to also then say, well, if what you're saying is true, what else should have to be true? Or what predictions can you make based on your assumption? It becomes more of we're probing each other now, and not just trying to whip out points as fast as we can, which so many conversations end up being, is just whipping out points.
Yes. And the thing that is different about 52 Living Ideas is that by and large, we managed, we've done about 1,000 meetups. And I think our meetups have that quality of yes and built in very deeply in everything that we do. So a lot of the problems that are there in the general culture, I don't think are there in the conversation that we have. So we have this principle internalized in some very deep way. And that's why I think it's, it's wonderful to have Mike do this on Improv. So now for a finale, we are going to be talking about the following. So feel free to add your own thoughts. Maritza said, we need a 52 living ideas bus, road trip. And Allison says, Shrikant would be the tour guide. Evanik could drive. Jason would flip off other drivers with his paws. Mike would make jokes. Joe would tell Evanik to drive more carefully. Maritza would be the backseat driver. And I would be the what's girl telling Evanik where to drive. Would anybody like to add anything to this? Go ahead. Let's start with Mike.
This mic or the magical
Yes.
mic?
Yes, this mic. Anybody wants to add anything to this setup? The driving setup, the drive team setup. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Mike, what
Yeah,
would you add?
I have an actually very clear picture in my mind now of Allison holding her device, whether it be, I don't know where Waze would be on her phone, and Evanik driving the car, and Evanik is trying to stay calm because Allison is literally shaking as she's pushing the buttons and she's yelling at Waze, but it's not on the voice recorder. She really needs to use her fingers. And she keeps going, I can't reroute. And I'm looking at Evanik's face, and Evanik is kind of just sitting there, kind of tightening up. And you know, I just see those two in that seat side by side, Allison staring at the phone, trying to get it to work, and Evanik doing her best. She's like, okay, we're doing all right. That's my initial view.
Wonderful. Maritza.
Evanik is stressing, and Joe looks at both of them. He puts one arm on each lady's because he's behind them, and he's ignoring me because I'm like, go left. And Joe puts one arm on each girl and go, ladies, what would Marcus Aurelius tell us to do? Anger is not the key.
Wonderful, Joe.
I was actually you actually took something that I was going to actually say. I was going to say, you know, Maritza's going to say, we're never going to get there, giving directions, how fast we need to go. And I'm going to be saying, we're going to get in an accident. We're going to get in an accident the whole time. So that we'd be disagreeing with one another. That's all.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. So Mike, this is wonderful series. Wait a minute, folks, please feel free to add more. Allison and Evanik, go ahead and add more, please.
Oh, I was just going to say that Maritza, Evanik, and I went to the Renaissance Fair last year, and I was driving, and we wound up, my way sent us to like the middle of a cornfield, and they were very like upset with me. We're going to this is not too far from reality. It really isn't. But we did need Joe to tell them to stop screaming at me.
We were an hour out of the way.
I got us there.
It was not out of the way,
Not
ladies.
your
Let's
turkey
be
leg. What more do
precise.
you want?
We were lost. It
Oh,
was
you see,
out of
Allison
the
I
had
way.
knew
put
it.
in the wrong address.
Well,
the
we're
way.
gonna go again. If any
I
of the
knew
rest
it.
want to join us, Halloween.
knew
feel
there was
free. Come on
I
history
am
down.
plotting to have a different driver.
I knew earlier, Shrikant, that there must be history here because the three of them I could see they were all laughing at the same time. So there has to be some history here.
Oh, and I forgot we were all dressed like wenches. So, you know, there's that.
Right.
Wonderful.
Shrikant, if I could add one thing to the scenario, so now that these three have elaborated, I could see them maybe all throwing popcorn at each other as the car's going, and you sitting there very calmly going, wonderful, wonderful.
Oh, one more thing I will add, as Joe is trying to calm me down, I'm like giving him dirty looks, talking about, shut up, I know how to drive. Do you want to drive? And I'll pull over and I'll be like, if you don't like my driving, get out and you can drive and I will ride the backseat. That's something I would do.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And we stopped at Wawa to get snacks. And Evanik's like, why is everyone staring at us? I'm like, we're wearing corsets. That's why.
All right, folks. So next Wednesday, this is going to be continued. We're going to build on this. I am just delighted. I think everybody is into this, Mike. And I
That was
think
a lot of fun. It really
yeah,
was.
we're going to be able to do a lot. This is going to be, we're going to do a 4-part series. I also want to tell you that, Yasuhiko is going to be back, and he's going to be talking about the psychology and cosmology of Übermensch. Übermensch, not as defined by Nietzsche, but as defined by him, of saying human beings at their best. What is their psychology like? And what is their worldview like? That's going to be Sunday at 11 a.m. So don't miss that. That's going to be incredible. All right. And we've got all kinds of stuff going on. This was a delightful meetup. We're going to be back. We'll be doing Gita tomorrow and Friday. Monday, folks, poetry is as much fun. Okay. It is, and we do improv in poetry, which is collaborative poetry. Marisa, don't you think that that's collaborative poetry is pretty much like improv? That's what we do.
It's pretty similar. Maybe not as much giggling, just a little bit less giggling. But no, it is.
I think that the giggle is very deep. It's like a smile.
Yeah,
that
slow
starts
build,
way
chuckle.
down and
Yeah.
spreads, and it's so folks, try out Mondays collaborative poetry, and we'll go look forward to it. Thank you very much, and thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe, for hosting this one today. I could jump in. I got off work early, so I was able to jump in and do this. So
No, I appreciate it. I appreciated being the observer and being part of the audience. It was nice to be a participant on this.
wonderful. And the other thing I like about this improv is it's such a different, it's a change of gear.
Yeah.
Right. Just like the poetry, it's a change of gear.
Yes.
So it's wonderful to have this whole range of things. And all right. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Mike.
Bye-bye. Yep.
Like.